The rain had no mercy on Seoul that night. It came down in sheets so thick that the city lights below bled into one another. Red, gold, white, like a painting left out in a storm. Han Ji-hoon stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse, 60 stories above everything, a glass of scotch in his hand and nothing in his eyes. The apartment behind him was worth $12 million. The suit on his back cost more than most people made in a year. The empire beneath his feet, the network of fear and money and blood that stretched across 3 countries, was worth more than some governments. And he was completely, devastatingly alone. On the marble table behind him sat a photograph. Old, the edges slightly curled. A woman with warm brown eyes and a smile that looked like it had been borrowed from somewhere genuinely peaceful. Beside her, a little girl, 4 years old, maybe 5, laughing so hard her whole body leaned sideways. They were at a park, somewhere ordinary, somewhere he had never bothered to visit with them. He didn't touch the photograph. He never did anymore. He just let it sit there and punish him. His phone buzzed. Business. It was always business. He turned from the window, set down his glass, and picked up the call, because that was all he knew how to do now. Function, operate, survive. But surviving, he had learned too late, was not the same thing as living. This is the story of how Han Ji-hoon, the most feared man in Korea, destroyed the only thing that ever truly mattered to him. Not with a bullet, not with a blade, but with silence, with pride, and with one catastrophic moment of choosing the wrong person in a room full of witnesses. This is the price of losing her. Sarah Smith had never been the kind of woman who chased danger. She was steady, warm, and quietly brilliant, the sort of person who remembered everyone's coffee order, who laughed easily and without performance, who believed, sometimes to a fault, that people were capable of being better than their worst impulses. She had come to Korea 6 years earlier on a 1-year consulting contract for an international design firm. She wasn't supposed to stay. She wasn't supposed to fall in love. She certainly wasn't supposed to fall in love with him. They met at a charity gala, ironically enough, hosted by one of Ji-hoon's front companies. He didn't usually attend these events in person. He sent representatives, made donations, maintained the illusion of legitimacy. But something had pulled him there that night, and he would later say, in one of his rare moments of honest reflection, that he was grateful it did. He saw her across the room, laughing at something an elderly man had said, touching the man's arm with a kind of genuine warmth that Ji-hoon found almost strange. Everyone in that room was performing. Politicians performing generosity. Celebrities performing humility. Business executives performing conscience. And then there was this woman who was simply completely present, as if the evening was exactly where she wanted to be. He introduced himself. She didn't flinch at his name. Either she didn't know who he was, or she didn't care. And both possibilities fascinated him equally. Han Ji-hoon, he said. Sarah Smith, she replied, shaking his hand without ceremony. Your flower arrangements are beautiful, by the way. Whoever designed this event has a real eye. He had looked around at the elaborate floral installations, as if seeing them for the first time. I'll pass that along, he said. She smiled. You should. People don't hear enough good things about their work. That was it. That was the moment. Not her beauty, though she was beautiful. Not charm or strategy or calculation. Just that small, offhand sentence, delivered with complete sincerity. In a world where everyone around Ji-hoon either feared him or wanted something from him, Sarah Smith had looked at a flower arrangement and thought about the anonymous person who made it. He was undone before the night was over. They dated for 8 months before she found out the full truth of what he was. He told her himself, which surprised even the people closest to him. He sat across from her in a quiet restaurant, told her everything, and waited. Most people, upon learning the real nature of Han Ji-hoon's operations, either ran or immediately recalculated how they could benefit. Sarah did neither. She sat quietly for a long time. Then she looked at him and said, "I'm not going to pretend this doesn't change things. But I don't think you told me because you want me to leave. I think you told me because you don't want to lie to me." He had no answer for that. She was right, and being seen so clearly by another person was terrifying and wonderful in equal measure. She married him 14 months later. She moved into his mansion. She learned Korean. She made friends with his staff, genuinely, not strategically. She planted herbs on the kitchen windowsill and filled rooms with color and softened the sharp, cold architecture of his life with a warmth he hadn't known he was missing. And then Mina came, and something in the house shifted permanently into light. Mina was everything. She had Sarah's eyes, and Ji-hoon's stubbornness, and a laugh that could stop a room. Ji-hoon, who had negotiated with violent men without breaking a sweat, who had walked into the most dangerous rooms in Asia and walked out with everything he wanted. This man was helpless against a 4-year-old who called him Appa and tugged at his sleeve. For a while, it was enough. The family dinners, the weekend mornings, Mina's drawings stuck to the refrigerator with magnets, impossibly colorful, depicting a family of 3 in broad, happy strokes. But the Mafia doesn't pause for happiness. And Ji-hoon, despite everything, despite the man he was trying to become inside those walls, was still fundamentally who he was. The late nights stretched longer. The business calls crept into dinners. The international trips multiplied. Weeks passed where Sarah and Mina were almost decorative, present in the house the way expensive furniture is present, acknowledged, but not truly engaged with. Sarah bore it with patience. She had to consciously choose every single day. She understood his world. She didn't enjoy it, but she understood it. What she couldn't understand, what began to quietly devastate her, was the growing emotional distance that had nothing to do with business hours. He stopped asking about her day. He stopped noticing when she was tired. He sat at the dinner table, and his eyes were always somewhere else, on his phone, on the window, on something in his head that had no room for her. One evening, when Mina had gone to bed and the house was quiet, Sarah sat across from him and said, gently but directly, "Mina is growing up without you." Ji-hoon looked up from his phone with the expression of a man being interrupted rather than spoken to. "Everything I'm doing is for this family," he said. "Everything. The business, the hours, all of it. It protects us. It provides for us." "She doesn't want provision," Sarah said. "She's 5. She wants her father." "Sarah, I'm not attacking you. I'm asking you to be here. Just be here." He said he would try, and he meant it, in the abstract way that busy people mean it when they haven't yet understood that time moves without waiting for intention. Then Yoon Seo-rin came back to Seoul, and whatever fragile progress they were making collapsed so fast it was almost violent. Seo-rin had been Ji-hoon's world before Sarah. They had been together for nearly 3 years. A tumultuous, combustible relationship built on attraction and mutual ambition, and the particular chemistry of 2 dangerously similar people. She had left for Paris, then Milan, then Singapore. Nobody in Ji-hoon's circle spoke about her openly, but everyone remembered her. She returned with the drama of someone who had been rehearsing an entrance for years. Elegant in the way that requires constant effort and looks effortless. Composed in the way that masks calculation. She went directly to Ji-hoon, not through intermediaries, not through formal channels, and told him she was in trouble. That rival factions were targeting her because of her old association with him, that she had nowhere else to turn. Ji-hoon, to his credit, hesitated. He thought of Sarah. He thought of the conversation about presence and family. Then Seo-rin looked at him with eyes that knew exactly which parts of him to aim at, and he agreed to extend his protection. He told Sarah over breakfast, casually, as if announcing a minor schedule adjustment. An old associate is back in Seoul. She's dealing with some threats. I'm providing security for her temporarily. Sarah's coffee cup paused midway to her mouth. She? The word was entirely neutral. Her tone was entirely neutral, but nothing was neutral. It's business, Ji-hoon said, not looking up from his phone. Of course, Sarah said. She set her cup down carefully and said nothing else. But from that morning, everything changed. Seo-rin began appearing everywhere. At the office, at events Ji-hoon attended, twice at the mansion itself, under the pretense of security briefings. She was always immaculate, always gracious in that precise way that communicates exclusion to the person being graced. She would greet Sarah with a warm smile and eyes like winter, and Sarah would return the smile and stand very still inside, the way a person stands still when they feel the ground shifting beneath them. The staff noticed. Staff always notice. Whispers started in the kitchen and spread outward. Not malicious whispers, mostly, but curious ones, which in some ways were worse. Reporters picked up on Seo-rin's return and speculated openly about its implications. Articles appeared online with headlines that Sarah didn't want to read, but couldn't avoid. Ji-hoon dismissed them as tabloid noise. He stopped coming home for dinner. He came home after midnight, smelling of cigarettes and bourbon and conversation she hadn't been part of. He slept at the edge of the bed with his back to her. He answered her questions in full sentences, but never with full attention. One afternoon, Sarah walked past Mina's playroom and stopped in the doorway. Mina was sitting on the floor with her crayons, drawing something. Sarah watched her quietly before stepping inside. "What are you making?" she asked, sitting beside her daughter. "Our family," Mina said simply, holding up the paper. There were 3 figures, tall, medium, small. Sarah, Ji-hoon, Mina. But in the drawing, the tall figure and the medium figure were standing apart, space between them that Mina had colored gray. Sarah stared at the drawing for a moment, then looked at her daughter's face. So focused, so earnest, so unaware of the emotional precision of what she'd just created. "Mina," Sarah said carefully, "are you happy?" Mina considered this with the gravity that 5-year-olds reserve for serious questions. "I'm happy with you, Mommy." A pause. "Why does Daddy smile more when that lady is around?" The question landed like a stone into still water. Sarah felt the ripple move through her entire body. She kept her face completely calm, the particular calm that mothers perform to protect their children from truths they shouldn't carry yet. "Daddy smiles plenty," she said. "Come on, let's make something for dinner." She held it together until Mina was distracted with the refrigerator, and then she turned to the window above the sink and stood very still, breathing, her hands gripping the counter edge, the tears she refused to release pressing behind her eyes like something trapped. She held it together. She always held it together. But the night of the gala, the night that changed everything, she ran out of places to put it. The annual charity event was one of the most high-profile gatherings in Seoul's social calendar. Politicians, industry leaders, celebrities, and a very select tier of people whose power was best not examined too closely. Ji-hoon was a central figure. His attendance was expected. His wife's attendance was expected alongside him. Sarah spent 2 hours getting ready. She chose a deep burgundy gown, structured, elegant, unshowy. She wore the earrings Ji-hoon had given her on their 3rd anniversary, back when anniversaries were still occasions. She looked in the mirror when she was finished, and told herself the only thing she knew how to tell herself in those days: you can do this. They arrived together, which meant they arrived in the same car and walked through the same door. Ji-hoon's hand was at her back for precisely the time it took photographers to capture their entrance, and then it was gone, and he was absorbed into conversations with men she didn't know. And Sarah moved gracefully into the room and found people to speak with, and smiled until her face accepted the shape of it. Seo Rin appeared within 20 minutes. She was wearing ivory, a choice so specific in that room on that night, it could not have been accidental. She moved to Ji-hoon first, touched his arm in greeting, laughed at something he said. Sarah watched from across the room with a glass of champagne and a stillness that had nothing peaceful in it. Later, during a quiet lull when Ji-hoon had moved to speak with a government official, Seo Rin appeared at Sarah's side. "You look lovely," Seo Rin said, with a smile so practiced it had the texture of marble. "That color is very bold for someone in your position." Sarah turned to look at her. "My position?" Seo Rin tilted her head slightly, as if choosing her words with care she wasn't actually taking. "It must be difficult," she said, her voice dropping to the confidential register of false concern. "Being the foreign wife. Always slightly outside of things. People talk, you know. They wonder how long it lasts." "I'm sure they do," Sarah said evenly. Seo Rin's smile didn't move. "He told me last week he feels trapped," she said. "I'm sure he didn't mean it, but he said it. I thought you should know. Woman to woman." The air in Sarah's lungs went cold. "You should be careful," Sarah said quietly, "about the things you claim people said." "I'm only trying to help." Seo Rin's voice was all innocence. "You gave up a great deal for him, and Mina, bringing a child into this world." She let the sentence drift, unfinished, which was somehow worse than anything she could have completed it with. Something broke open in Sarah, not dramatically, not in her face or her voice, but somewhere internal. A wall that had been absorbing pressure for months cracked clean through. She reached out and took hold of Seo Rin's wrist, not violently, but firmly. "Don't," she said. "Don't say my daughter's name." Seo Rin's eyes widened, and then, deliberately, with the timing of someone who had rehearsed it, she let her body go loose and stumbled backward, catching herself theatrically, her hand flying to her wrist as if she'd been struck. The champagne glass in her other hand tipped and spilled. She made a small, sharp sound of distress. The people nearby turned. The chatter around them dimmed. Heads swiveled with the magnetic efficiency of people who came to these events, hoping, on some level, for exactly this kind of scene. Ji-hoon was across the room. He heard the sound. He always heard disruptions, a survival reflex, and turned. He saw Seo Rin recovering her footing, hand pressed to her wrist. He saw the space between Sarah and Seo Rin. He saw the faces around them, half alarmed, half fascinated. And he crossed the room without stopping to think, without asking, without 1 second of hesitation in Sarah's direction. He reached Sarah and took her wrist, hard, not gently, and his face was something she had never seen directed at her before: fury, embarrassment, the cold, administrative anger of someone managing a problem. "What did you do?" he said. "Ji-hoon." "Not here." His grip tightened. "What is wrong with you?" The room was silent in the specific way that expensive rooms go silent. Everyone still holding their glasses, still wearing their expressions, but every atom of attention pointed at this single point in the center of the floor. "You're hurting my wrist," Sarah said quietly. He released her. He looked at Seo Rin. "Are you all right?" Seo Rin touched her wrist with dignified restraint. "I'm fine," she said softly. "Please don't make a scene on my account." Ji-hoon turned back to Sarah. "You're embarrassing me," he said. His voice was low but not quiet enough. "In front of everyone. Tonight of all nights." Sarah looked at him. Just looked at him. The tears were there. She could feel them. But they weren't falling. Not yet. Not here. She was looking at the man she had married with the very specific grief of someone watching a stranger's face inside a familiar one. Tonight of all nights, she repeated softly. And from the edge of the crowd, Mina's small face appeared, brought by a staff member who had panicked when the murmuring started and hadn't known what else to do. The little girl stood at the perimeter of the crowd, looking at her parents, at the space between them, at her father's expression and her mother's eyes, and her own face crumpled in the uncomplicated devastation of a child who doesn't yet have language for what she's witnessing, but understands every word of it. Sarah looked at her daughter. That was the moment. Not Ji-hoon's words, not Seo-rin's cruelty, not the audience or the silence or the grip on her wrist. Mina's face. That was the moment Sarah Smith made her decision. She excused herself calmly. She collected Mina from the edge of the crowd, took her by the hand, and walked out of the gala without looking back. Ji-hoon did not follow. He was already in conversation with Seo-rin again. Damage management, optics, his world reassembling itself around a narrative that had no room for what Sarah had just felt. The mansion was quiet when they arrived home. Sarah carried a sleeping Mina upstairs, tucked her in, sat at the edge of her daughter's bed for a long time in the dark. Mina's breathing was soft and even. Safe, unaware of everything. Sarah stood up, walked to their bedroom, opened the large wardrobe, and pulled down 2 bags from the top shelf. She packed with the methodical calm of someone who had been, without realizing it, preparing for this for a long time. She packed the essentials, documents first, then Mina's things, then her own. She moved quietly through the rooms, gathering what mattered and leaving everything that didn't. Her jewelry stayed. The gowns stayed. The expensive things Ji-hoon had given her that were beautiful and felt right now like the decorations on a life that hadn't been fully hers. She removed her wedding ring. She held it in her palm for a moment, that familiar small weight, and set it on the nightstand with deliberate care. Then she went to the wall where the family portrait hung, professional photographer, taken when Mina was 2, all 3 of them dressed in white against a neutral background. Ji-hoon had his arm around her. He was smiling. She looked at it for a long time. Then she picked up Mina, still sleeping, held her close, and walked out of the house. Ji-hoon did not come home until dawn. He moved through the silent mansion without alerting to the absence at first. Silence was normal. Pre-dawn hours were normal. He poured water in the kitchen, loosened his tie, checked his phone. It was only when he moved toward the bedroom and noticed the nightstand that something registered. The ring. He crossed to it in 2 steps, picked it up, stood very still, called Sarah's phone. It rang 6 times and went to voicemail, her voice warm and recorded and already inaccessible. He went to Mina's room, empty, perfectly made bed. A single crayon on the floor, yellow, that Mina must have dropped, and that nobody had picked up because nobody had been there to pick it up. He stood in his daughter's room in his $5,000 suit at 5 in the morning, holding a yellow crayon, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Han Ji-hoon did not know what to do. He searched. Of course he searched. He had resources most governments didn't. But Sarah had been more prepared than he'd understood. There were financial accounts he'd never known about, quietly assembled over years, not from dishonesty, he would later realize, but from the quiet self-preservation of a woman who had married a dangerous man and understood, somewhere deep and unacknowledged, that she needed an exit that was entirely her own. The trail went cold at the airport. International departure. 2 passengers. Destination unknown. She was gone. He told himself it was temporary, that she needed space, that she'd call when she was ready. He said this with decreasing conviction across 3 weeks, then 5, then 2 months, while the mansion contracted around him like a space becoming aware of itself as empty. It was a loyal employee, a man who had worked for Ji-hoon for over a decade, and who was, in his private conscience, someone who still believed in something like justice, who finally brought him what he needed to know. The man came to him quietly in the early morning and laid out what he had found. Seo Rin had paid 3 journalists. The articles speculating about Ji-hoon's marriage hadn't been gossip. They had been ordered. She had coordinated the late-night calls to Ji-hoon's direct line during hours she knew would cause maximum damage to Sarah's peace of mind. The lipstick on his collar after 2 particular evenings. Planted. Physically planted. While Ji-hoon's jacket had been left in a conference room. The gala fall had been the culmination of months of patient, precise construction. The security footage from the event had been edited, not erased, but trimmed. The 2 minutes before Sarah reached for Seo Rin's wrist removed, leaving only the moment of contact, stripped of all the context that would have explained everything. Ji-hoon listened to all of it without moving. Then he said, very quietly, "Leave me." The employee left, and Han Ji-hoon, who had faced down rivals, with weapons, who had negotiated in rooms where the wrong word meant death, who had built an empire on the bedrock of absolute control, sat down in his office chair and put his head in his hands. Sarah had never grabbed Seo Rin. She had held her wrist for 3 seconds in defense of her daughter's name, in response to months of deliberate torture, and Ji-hoon had stood in a silent room full of witnesses and called it an embarrassment. He had gripped her wrist and not listened. He had turned to Seo Rin with concern, while his wife stood beside him with shattered eyes. He stood up. He picked up the nearest thing, a heavy crystal award, some industry recognition that meant nothing, and threw it at the wall. Then the next thing. Then the next. He dismantled his office with a violence that was really just grief, wearing the only clothes it knew. And when there was nothing left to throw, he sat on the floor among the debris, and breathed and breathed and breathed. He cut Seo Rin off entirely. No explanation, no confrontation. She simply found that every door had closed, every contact had gone cold, every protection had evaporated. She left Seoul within the month. He didn't ask where she went and didn't care. But none of it brought Sarah back. None of it undid the gala. None of it unspoke the words. None of it removed the image he couldn't stop seeing, Mina's face at the edge of that crowd, watching her parents, understanding everything and nothing, and all of it at once. 5 years passed. Ji-hoon's empire grew larger. Fear of him deepened in the circles that feared him. He acquired more territory, more resources, more influence. He sat at the head of longer tables and gave orders to more people and won more of the games he played. He was, by every external measure, at the height of his power. He lived alone. He kept Sarah's photograph in the drawer of his nightstand. Face down, he couldn't explain why. Some vestigial superstition about deserving to see it. And sometimes, in the specific insomnia of 3 in the morning, he would take it out and hold it, and think about what he would say if he had another moment. He never drank enough to stop the thinking. Just enough to blur the edges of it. He never remarried. He rarely dated. He went to events because the empire required presence, and he came home to a house that remained impeccably maintained and completely hollow. Sarah was in London. She had built, with characteristic quiet intelligence, a luxury interior design company that had grown, within 3 years, into one of the more respected boutique firms in the European market. She had an eye for space, for what made a room feel inhabited, rather than merely furnished, for the texture of warmth as a designed quality. Her clients loved her. She had friends, real ones, the kind built slowly over shared dinners, and honest conversation rather than strategic proximity. She ran along the Thames in the mornings. She cooked elaborate Sunday breakfasts for Mina, who was now 10, and opinionated and funny, and thoroughly herself. Mina barely remembered Korea. Not because Sarah had hidden it. She answered every question her daughter asked with honesty calibrated for age. But because 10-year-olds are comprehensively of the present, and Mina's present was full and bright and sufficient. Sarah smiled differently now. It was the particular smile of someone who has survived something they weren't sure they'd survive and discovered, on the other side of it, that they were more intact than they'd feared. She didn't hate Ji-hoon. She had moved through fury and grief and arrived at something more complete, an understanding, clear-eyed, and without bitterness, that some people are capable of love and incapable of the changes love requires. That had been her answer to years of wondering if she'd done enough, said enough, been patient enough. She had. It simply wasn't about enough. Ji-hoon came to London on a Thursday in November. Routine business, meetings with European partners. 2 days. No personal element whatsoever. He walked out of a building in Kensington in the early afternoon, collar up against the cold, phone to his ear, already mentally in the next meeting. He saw her. He saw Sarah before she saw him. She was across the street, walking with Mina, who was taller now, a proper girl, carrying a bag over one shoulder, with the self-consciousness of someone who had recently decided she was old enough to carry her own things. Sarah was speaking to her, gesturing at something ahead, and Mina was rolling her eyes in the way that children roll their eyes at mothers and suppressing a smile while doing it. Ji-hoon stopped walking. His phone conversation ended, or continued without him. He genuinely didn't know. Everything in his field of vision contracted to the two of them across the street in the gray London afternoon, alive and complete and entirely without him. He crossed the road before he'd decided to. His body moved while his mind was still catching up. Sarah. She heard her name and turned. The sequence of expressions that crossed her face in the following 2 seconds was beyond his ability to fully read. Recognition, surprise, something that might have been fear, or might have been old grief reflexing into the present, before it all settled into stillness, the particular stillness he had always known in her. Ji-hoon, she said. Mina looked at him with the frank, assessing gaze of a 10-year-old who has not yet learned to disguise her readings of people. She stepped closer to her mother, not dramatically, just a small, decisive repositioning. That small movement cost him something he couldn't quantify. "You look," he started. "What are you doing in London?" she asked, not unkindly, just directly. "Business," he said. Then, "I didn't know you were here. I didn't plan." "I know," she said. A pause opened between them, wide and full of everything 5 years contained. He looked older. She could see it, not badly, but truly. The edges of him had changed in the way that a face changes when it has been processing something difficult for a long time. "Mina," he said, looking at his daughter. "Hi." Mina looked at him for a long moment. Then she pressed closer to Sarah's side and looked away. Just that. Just a child who did not know him, pressed against the person she did know, looking elsewhere. Ji-hoon received it in total silence. "I owe you an apology," he said, turning back to Sarah. "I've owed you one for 5 years. I know that's not enough. I know saying it now doesn't—" He stopped, started again. "I found out what she did. All of it. What she engineered. What I believed instead of what I should have believed. I destroyed my office. I cut her off. I know none of that helps you. But I need you to know that I know." Sarah listened to all of it. She didn't interrupt. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Not in deliberation, but in the measured care of someone who knows that what they say next will be the last significant thing they say to someone. "You didn't lose us that night at the gala," she said. "I want you to understand that. One night didn't do this." He waited. "You lost us slowly," she said. "Every time you chose your phone over dinner. Every time you made me feel like a problem you were managing instead of a person you were loving. Every time Mina asked where you were, and I had to build her an answer from almost nothing." She paused. "Seo Rin didn't break our marriage, Ji-hoon. She just walked through a door that was already open. The The truth of it moved through him like something physical. "Tell me what to do," he said, and the words came out stripped of every layer of the man he performed for the rest of the world. No command, no composure, just the raw underbelly of someone who has run out of strategy. "Tell me what I can do. I'll do anything." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, and he could see it, the flicker of what had been, the genuine love she had carried for him, still present somewhere in her, like an ember that had survived the rain. He could see that she saw his pain and was not indifferent to it. She was not cold. She had never been cold. "Some mistakes," she said quietly, "don't deserve forgiveness. Not because I haven't forgiven you. I have. For my own sake, I have. But forgiveness doesn't mean return. It doesn't mean we rebuild something that cost Mina her childhood sense of safety." She glanced at their daughter, then back at him. "You made your choices. You made them slowly, every day, for years. I made mine too. Mine brought us here. I'm glad they did." She reached out, one small gesture, entirely her, and touched his arm briefly. Not warmly, not coldly, just honestly. "I hope you find something worth living for," she said. "Not worth controlling. Worth living for." Then she took Mina's hand, and she walked away. He stood on the pavement, in the cold London afternoon, and watched them go. Mina glanced back once, not at him exactly, just the general backward look of a child in motion. Then they rounded a corner, and were gone. He stood there for a long time after, long enough that people moved around him with the polite indifference of a busy city, long enough that the cold settled properly into his coat. His phone buzzed, his driver texted, his empire waited. He went back to Seoul. He sat in his penthouse with its skyline and its silence and its $12 million of emptiness. The photograph stayed face down in the drawer. He didn't take it out that night. In London, 2 hours later in their time zone, Sarah sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, while Mina did homework across from her, complaining cheerfully about mathematics. The lamp above them was warm yellow. Outside the window, the city hummed its steady nighttime hum. The kitchen smelled like the chicken she'd made for dinner, and Mina had flour on her sleeve from a baking experiment that had gone sideways at approximately 2 o'clock, and everything was exactly as small and alive and real as it should be. Sarah wrapped both hands around her mug and looked at her daughter's bent head, at the concentration on her face, at the small smile Mina was wearing because she thought no one was looking. And Sarah smiled too. Quietly, fully, in the way that only becomes possible when you have stopped waiting for someone else to give you permission to be happy. She had left behind a mansion, a ring, a life that was supposed to be everything. In its place, she had built something smaller in scale and immeasurable in worth. She had built a life where she was fully present, not decorative, not patient, not enduring. Present. Engaged. Loved without conditions. Han Ji-hoon had once said that everything he did was for the family. But you cannot give a family your empire and withhold yourself and call it love. You cannot build walls of money around people you are not there to actually hold. You cannot protect someone from everything except your own indifference. He conquered rivals. He conquered markets. He conquered fear. He never conquered the simpler, more demanding territory of being fully present in a room with the people he loved. Back in Seoul, in his penthouse above the bleeding lights of the city, Han Ji-hoon stood at the window again. Rain again. The glass in his hand again. The silence pressing in from every side. He had everything. He would spend the rest of his life understanding exactly what that meant. If this story moved you, if Sarah's courage spoke to something in you, or if Ji-hoon's regret hit somewhere close, please hit that like button and let this story reach someone who needs it. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next, because there are more stories like this one waiting. Stories about love, about loss, about the choices that define us long after we've stopped thinking about them. And drop a comment below. Whose side were you on? Did Sarah make the right choice? Tell me what you think. I read every single one.